December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The sun had barely risen when hell fell from the sky. Explosions tore through Battleship Row. Fire, smoke, and chaos engulfed the harbor. On the USS West Virginia, men scrambled for cover, screams echoing through twisted steel. Amid the panic, one man, a cook named Dorie Miller, ran toward the flames. He wasn't a pilot nor a gunner. His duty was to serve breakfast, not battle. But when his captain fell and enemy planes swooped low, Miller climbed behind an anti-aircraft gun, a weapon he had never been trained to use. As bombs fell, he pulled the trigger. No one knew it then, but this cook's courage would challenge the U.S. Navy's own sense of justice. October 12th, 1919. Waco, Texas. Born the third of four sons to Connery and Henrietta Miller, Doris Miller grew up in the heart of segregated Texas. Life was simple but hard. His family worked the land, raising crops and livestock, surviving more on grit than on hope. Tall, broad-shouldered, and quietly confident, young Dorie was known for his strength. At Moore High School, he excelled in football and farm work, earning respect in a time when Black Americans were rarely shown any. But when the Great Depression deepened, college became impossible. At 19, seeking opportunity beyond the cotton fields, Miller joined the U.S. Navy in 1939, one of the few ways a black man could earn steady pay. Yet even in uniform, he found himself limited to mess duty, serving food, scrubbing decks, and cleaning, never fighting. Still, he served with pride. Fellow sailors recalled his quiet humor, discipline, and powerful sense of duty. Beneath the calm, however, there was frustration, a longing to do more than carry trays. "They wouldn't even let us touch the guns," one black sailor later said. But Dorie, he always said our time would come, but that was only the beginning. By 1940, Miller was stationed aboard the USS West Virginia, a massive battleship with a crew of over 1,400 men. He worked in the ship's galley, cooking, cleaning, and serving officers. Known for his strength, he was soon assigned as the ship's heavyweight boxing champion and personal attendant to Captain Mervyn Bennion. While others drilled with rifles, Miller's days were routine: early mornings, hot kitchens, and long hours. Yet he never complained. To him, the Navy represented discipline and dignity, even within the confines of segregation. But beneath the calm routine, tensions in the Pacific were rising. Japan's empire was expanding rapidly, and whispers of war reached every sailor's ear. By late 1941, the West Virginia had anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, a paradise waiting for a storm. In the early hours of December 7th, Miller was below deck preparing breakfast. Moments later, his world exploded. Torpedoes slammed into the ship, flames engulfed compartments, and orders turned to chaos. When Miller rushed topside, he saw the captain wounded, mortally hit by shrapnel. Without hesitation, he carried him to safety, then turned to help move the injured. All around him, gunfire raged. He saw unmanned weapons and a sky filled with enemy planes. That's when the cook made a choice that would echo through history. He stepped behind a gun he'd never been allowed to touch. The attack on Pearl Harbor was unlike anything the U.S. Navy had ever faced. In less than 2 hours, 353 Japanese aircraft, bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters rained destruction across the harbor. Battleships burned, aircrafts exploded mid-air. The USS Arizona split in half. The USS West Virginia, Miller's ship, took 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs, sinking slowly beneath waves of oil and fire. Below deck, sailors suffocated in smoke-filled compartments. Above deck, chaos reigned. Men diving overboard, ammunition cooking off, and anti-aircraft gunners cut down in seconds. The U.S. Navy's defenses were unprepared. Planes were parked wingtip to wingtip. Ammunition was locked away. The few who reached their stations were met with overwhelming firepower. In the middle of this chaos, there was a deeper problem, one no one talked about openly. Black sailors like Doris Miller were not trained for combat. Regulations restricted them to service roles, cooks, cleaners, or stewards. Guns were considered off-limits, so when Miller found himself facing enemy bombers, he had two choices: obey the unspoken boundaries of race, or act on instinct and courage. He chose the latter. Standing beside Ensign Frederick White and Lieutenant Dewar Johnson, Miller took position behind a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft gun. The weapon was massive, designed to pierce aircraft armor. But for Miller, it was completely unfamiliar. He had never even pulled its trigger before that moment, and yet, when the next dive bomber screamed down toward the ship, Miller aimed and fired. For decades, the U.S. Navy had been a reflection of America's own segregated society. Its logic was rigid: black men could serve, but not fight. The official reasoning was that they lacked the discipline for combat, a cruel lie born of prejudice, not proof. Even as war loomed, military leadership refused to integrate its forces. No training manuals, no drills, no access to weapons. Black sailors worked in the background, invisible, unheard, and unarmed. This wasn't just unfair, it was dangerous. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, countless ships had men like Miller, strong, willing but untrained to defend themselves. And so, the impossible challenge wasn't just Japan's surprise attack, it was America's own blindness. When Miller grabbed that gun, it wasn't rebellion. It was necessity. He watched his shipmates die. He saw the flames crawling closer. He understood that survival meant action, not permission. For 15 minutes, Miller fired the .50 caliber gun until his ammunition ran dry, hitting at least 2, possibly 3 Japanese planes. Witnesses later described him as calm and steady, like he'd been trained all his life. But when the smoke cleared, something deeper remained. The Navy could no longer ignore what had happened. A man they had trained only to serve breakfast had defended a battleship. A man they'd never allowed to touch a weapon had proven himself in the deadliest attack on American soil. And then came an idea so absurd, it almost worked. Could the courage of one black sailor force the Navy to question its own segregation? Doris Miller didn't invent a weapon. He reinvented the idea of who could be a hero. In a military bound by hierarchy and prejudice, his act was revolutionary, not in machinery, but in mindset. His radical idea wasn't forged in a lab. It was born in a moment of chaos, when courage replaced command. He proved that training and rank do not define bravery, character does. When word of his actions spread across the harbor, sailors began whispering, "A colored messman manned a gun," and took down enemy planes. Officers couldn't believe it. One report described him as a man of exceptional initiative. Another refused to name him, simply calling him a Negro mess attendant. Skeptics dismissed the story at first, but survivors from the West Virginia backed it up. This was no rumor. It was the truth, and it was too powerful to ignore. After the attack, the U.S. Navy launched immediate investigations into the events at Pearl Harbor. Officers interviewed survivors, documenting every act of bravery, from captains to cooks. When Captain Bennion was confirmed dead and the West Virginia sank, one detail kept reappearing in testimonies. A Negro messman carried the captain to safety, then manned an anti-aircraft gun and fired until ammunition was exhausted. Initially, the Navy didn't release Miller's name. In official reports, he was described only by his rank, mess attendant 3rd class, but word spread through the black press. Papers like the Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender began demanding his identity. When it finally came out, Doris Miller of Waco, Texas, he became an instant symbol of courage. African-American communities across the country rallied around him. They called him the first black hero of World War II. Churches held prayer meetings in his honor. Posters appeared in Harlem and Chicago, his smiling face printed beneath the words, "He fought for freedom abroad. Will America give him freedom at home?" Inside the Navy, the reaction was mixed. Some officers praised his valor. Others were uneasy. Recognizing him meant acknowledging that their segregation policies were unjust. Still, On May 27, 1942, aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Chester Nimitz personally awarded Miller the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. Standing on deck, Nimitz said, "This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race." Photographers captured the moment. Miller, stoic and humble, saluting the admiral. The crowd erupted in applause, but beyond the ceremony, the real test had only begun. The Navy proudly displayed Miller's image in posters and recruitment ads, portraying him as proof of opportunity. Yet behind the scenes, nothing changed. Miller was not promoted, not allowed to fight, and not reassigned to a combat role. He became a symbol, but not a soldier. He toured bases and shipyards, smiling for photos, giving short speeches, urging black men to enlist. But he quietly knew the truth. His heroism had been celebrated, not honored. As one journalist later wrote, "They used his courage to inspire others, but never gave him the chance to do it again." Still, Miller accepted his fate with grace. When asked how he felt about being famous, he replied simply, "I just did what any man would do when his ship is under attack." It worked, but proving it in war was another story. Doris Miller's recognition was both a breakthrough and a contradiction. On paper, the U.S. Navy had honored a black man for heroism, a first in its history. But in practice, segregation remained the rule. Black sailors could now see their hero on posters, yet still couldn't serve beside white men in battle. Behind the inspiring propaganda, there was no real change in training, no integrated combat instruction, and no pathway for promotion. Instead, the Navy continued to treat Miller as a symbol of morale, not progress. When civil rights groups demanded reforms, the Navy issued vague promises of gradual inclusion. But for the men inside the system, men like Miller, every promise felt hollow. The true test of his heroism would come not through medals or speeches, but through what happened next, a war that refused to wait for fairness. The fight to be seen was only beginning. By late 1942, Miller was reassigned to the USS Indianapolis and later to the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay. He had become a national figure, his image used to recruit black Americans to the Navy. Propaganda posters featured his portrait with the slogan, "Above and beyond the call of duty, Dorie Miller stands for his people." Across the United States, enlistment among African Americans surged. Thousands joined the Navy, inspired by the idea that courage might finally be rewarded with equality. But inside the fleet, daily life told a different story. The Navy expanded its training programs, but still kept black recruits segregated, confined to mess duty or minor maintenance work. It wasn't until 1943 that pressure from civil rights leaders and the black press pushed President Roosevelt to create the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, forcing military industries to address discrimination. Even then, the pace of reform was glacial. Black sailors like Miller were invited to pose for cameras, not train with weapons. He remained a mess attendant, despite being a national hero and a proven gunner. Letters poured into Navy headquarters from journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens, demanding that Miller be promoted or given combat training. But bureaucracy and prejudice prevailed. By mid-1943, Miller, ever humble, stopped asking for advancement. He wrote to his family, "I'm still just doing my duty. Maybe that's all I'm meant to do." Then came the next phase of war, the Pacific Island campaigns. The Navy needed every hand it could get. Miller was reassigned to the USS Liscombe Bay, a new escort carrier bound for the Gilbert Islands, part of the Allied advance toward Japan. On board, Miller's duties were the same: cooking, cleaning, assisting officers. But the crew knew who he was. To them, he wasn't just a mess man. He was the man from Pearl Harbor. Sailors often saluted him in passing. One shipmate recalled, "When Dorie walked through the mess deck, men straightened their backs. He gave us something the Navy hadn't: pride." Yet fate was not done with him. At dawn on November 24, 1943, as the Liscum Bay sailed near Macon Island, a Japanese submarine fired a torpedo. It struck the ship's bomb storage area. The explosion was catastrophic. Within minutes, the carrier was engulfed in flames and sinking. Of the 916 men aboard, 646 died, including Doris, Dorie Miller. There were no photographs, no witnesses of his final moments, only the silence of the sea. He had survived Pearl Harbor, but not the war that followed, and so ended the life of a man who had changed history, not by invention or command, but by the force of simple human courage. The USS Liscum Bay was part of Task Group 52.3, assigned to support the U.S. invasion of the Gilbert Islands, a critical stage in America's island-hopping campaign toward Japan. It was November 1943, nearly 2 years after Pearl Harbor. The Pacific War had shifted tides, but the risks were higher than ever. The Liscum Bay was an escort carrier, smaller, lighter, and faster than traditional carriers, but also far more vulnerable. Unlike the massive Enterprise or Yorktown, it carried little armor. One direct hit could ignite its fuel or bomb storage and doom the entire crew. Miller, now a mess attendant first class, worked in the galley below deck. His daily routine was ordinary: breakfast, cleanup, assisting officers, yet the threat outside was constant. Japanese submarines roamed the waters, hunting U.S. ships with stealth and precision. The plan was simple: maintain air support for the Marines fighting ashore at Makin Atoll. But even simple missions in the Pacific could turn into death traps. Everyone knew the risk. Few admitted the fear. Still, Miller remained calm, the same steady presence who had once faced fire at Pearl Harbor. To the men around him, he wasn't just Dorie the cook. He was living proof that courage had no color. November 24th, 1943, 5:10 a.m. The Liscum Bay was preparing to launch planes for another day of air support. Dawn broke in faint orange over calm seas. Then from beneath the surface a shadow moved. Japanese submarine I-175, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata, had spotted the task group. It fired a spread of torpedoes at the escort carriers. When found its mark, the torpedoes struck the Liscum Bay on her starboard side, directly where the ship stored bombs and ammunition. The result was instantaneous. The explosion ripped through the carrier's interior, sending a fireball hundreds of feet into the air. Witnesses on nearby ships saw the entire midsection erupt, throwing debris and men overboard. Flames tore through compartments. Smoke billowed skyward. In the galley where Miller was stationed, there was no time to escape. Within seconds, the ship's fuel ignited. A second, then a third explosion followed. The Liscum Bay began to sink. Captain Irving D. Wiltse and Rear Admiral Henry Malinix were killed instantly. Within 23 minutes, the ship was gone, swallowed by the Pacific. Out of 916 crew members, 272 survived. The rest, including Doris Dorie Miller, were lost at sea. No one saw him die, but those who knew him believed he died the same way he lived, helping others. When news of the Liscum Bay's destruction reached home, it was first described as a tragic loss. Then, when Miller's name appeared on the list of missing, a wave of grief swept through black communities across America. Churches held vigils. Newspapers ran black-bordered headlines: "Pearl Harbor hero lost in action." In Waco, Texas, his mother Henrietta received the telegram in silence. She later said, "I knew when I saw the man in uniform. My boy was gone." Across the nation, tributes poured in, but alongside sorrow came anger. Civil rights groups demanded that the Navy not just honor Miller, but change because of him. The NAACP, led by Walter White, petitioned Congress for equal training and promotion opportunities for black sailors. Editorials asked the haunting question, if Dorie Miller was good enough to die for his country, why wasn't he good enough to fight for it? The contradiction was clear. The Navy had celebrated him as a hero, yet kept its doors closed to those who wanted to follow his example. Still, his sacrifice could not be erased. His face, calm, proud, determined, had become a symbol of both glory and injustice. Even President Roosevelt, who had approved Miller's Navy Cross, reportedly spoke of him in private admiration. But bureaucracy moved slower than history. Segregation in the military would not end until 1948, 5 years after Miller's death. When President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, integrating the armed forces, it was too late for Dorie, but not too late for those who came after him. Years later, survivors of the Liscum Bay still spoke of Miller with reverence. They recalled how his calm presence had inspired others under fire, even before his final mission. One shipmate, Seaman Second Class Gilbert Bowen, later said, "He was the kind of man you wanted beside you when things went wrong." He didn't talk much, he just acted. For many, Miller's story became more than a tale of wartime courage. It became a mirror, reflecting America's unfinished promise. He had stood at Pearl Harbor when his country wasn't ready for him, and still defended it. He had died in the Pacific, fighting for freedoms he was never fully given. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but there was another truth beneath that irony, a quieter, nobler one. That in the darkest hours, courage needs no permission and patriotism wears no color. Miller's story spread far beyond the military. Schools were named after him. Songs and poems were written in his honor. His courage inspired a new generation of black servicemen who would go on to fight in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, under a flag that finally began to recognize their worth. A fellow sailor once said, "Dorie Miller didn't just shoot down planes. He shot down a wall, one built by ignorance. He didn't survive the Pacific, but his spirit survived every barrier that tried to hold him back. They didn't fail, the sea did." When the smoke of war cleared, the name Doris Dorie Miller became both legend and lesson. To millions, he was the face of courage, a man who had risen above the chains of prejudice to defend a nation that had not yet defended him. But to the Navy, his memory was complicated. In official records, he remained mess attendant first class. No posthumous promotion. No full military honors until years later. The same institution that had praised him publicly quietly let his name fade from active service roles. Yet in African American homes across America, Dorie Miller's story never faded. Children learned his name in church halls and schoolrooms. Black newspapers kept his image alive, a reminder that heroism could come from anywhere, and often from those least expected to receive recognition. Miller's legacy forced a national conversation. His act of bravery, broadcast through newspapers, radio, and even wartime propaganda films, directly challenged the myth that African Americans lacked courage or discipline. Civil rights leaders seized his story as evidence. The Pittsburgh Courier's Double V campaign, Victory Abroad, Victory at Home, used Miller's name to call for an end to racial segregation in the armed forces. Editorials argued that if a man like Miller could face Japanese bombers with a borrowed gun, then black Americans could certainly handle leadership and combat roles. Gradually, the narrative began to shift. By 1944, the Navy opened limited training for black sailors in gunnery, communications, and engineering, a direct result of the pressure sparked by Miller's heroism. When President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, integrating the U.S. military, many saw it as the culmination of a journey that had begun on December 7, 1941, when one mess attendant refused to stand idle. Miller didn't live to see that change, but his courage lit the path toward it. Years after his death, the honors finally came. In 1973, the U.S. Navy launched the USS Miller FF-1091, a Knox-class frigate named in his memory. In 2020, nearly 80 years after Pearl Harbor, the Navy announced something even greater. A new aircraft carrier would bear his name, USS Doris Miller, CVN-81. It would be the first U.S. Navy aircraft carrier ever named after an African American, and the first named in honor of an enlisted sailor. At the dedication ceremony, Admiral John Richardson said, "Doris Miller stood for everything the Navy and our nation aspire to be: honor, courage, commitment. From mess hall to war hero, from forgotten name to a ship that will carry aircraft across oceans, Miller's story had come full circle." And in his hometown of Waco, Texas, a life-size bronze statue stands in quiet tribute. Beneath it are words that sum up a legacy larger than any medal: "He fought for all of us." The story of Dorie Miller is not just about one man's courage. It's about the courage to see beyond roles, ranks, and race. He was never trained to fight, yet he fought. He was never allowed to lead, yet he led by example. He didn't rewrite military doctrine. He rewrote what heroism could look like. Though history often celebrates generals and admirals, it's the courage of men like Miller that keeps their ships afloat. The tragedy is that he had to prove his worth in the flames of war. The triumph is that he did, and in doing so, he changed the course of history. From a cook with no weapon to a warrior with a legacy, Dorie Miller proved that bravery knows no uniform. History remembers December 7th, 1941 as a day of infamy. But within that chaos, beneath the smoke, the burning ships and the echoing alarms, rose a moment of quiet defiance. A young black sailor, denied the right to even touch a weapon in training, grabbed one in war and stood his ground. That moment defined Dorie Miller. It wasn't just the bullets he fired, it was what those bullets represented. Every round that streaked into the sky was a cry for recognition, not only of his own humanity, but of all those like him who served in silence. He didn't live to see victory. He didn't see his name engraved in bronze or ships bearing his initials. But he had already won something greater, a place in history that no policy or prejudice could erase. Dorie Miller's act became a catalyst for transformation. During World War II, over 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. military, in supply units, construction battalions, and segregated infantry. Many were inspired by Miller's courage, by the idea that service could be both sacrifice and protest. In 1943, the U.S. Navy produced a propaganda short film, The Negro Sailor, using Miller's story to rally black enlistment. But even in the 1940s, some white audiences refused to believe that a black cook could have done what the reports claimed. It took decades of documentation, witness testimony, and historical research before the Navy formally acknowledged that Miller's actions had likely saved dozens of lives aboard the USS West Virginia. His courage helped lay the foundation for change, from the Tuskegee Airmen to the integration of the military, to the eventual rise of black admirals and generals. In every salute they give, a small echo of Dorie Miller lives on. Dorie's story carries a deeper truth. War doesn't only test nations, it reveals them. When chaos strikes, medals and ranks lose meaning. What remains is human instinct, the choice between fear and action. Miller's decision to fight wasn't about orders or recognition. It was a simple act of duty, born from decency and courage, the kind of courage that history often overlooks until it's too late. He reminds us that greatness is not given. It's proven, often by those whom society least expects to be heroes. And in that sense, Dorie Miller fought 2 wars, one against Japan and another against the invisible enemy of racism. He won both, even if one took decades for the world to notice. Today, the USS Doris Miller, CVN 81, stands as a floating monument to that moment of defiance. Every takeoff from its deck, every salute on its bridge, will carry his story across oceans. The cook who became a symbol, the sailor who became a statement. When you hear the words, "Remember Pearl Harbor," remember also the man who fought with nothing but courage. Because sometimes history isn't written by those who hold power. It's written by those who dare to act when no one else will.